Hello and welcome to another episode of CH Network Presents, where we have conversations about all the kinds of questions that people wrestle with when they're exploring the Catholic Church and perhaps wondering if they want to become a part of it. Also questions that apply to people who are in it and still trying to figure out where the door is. So I'm Matt Swaim, Outreach Manager for the Coming Home Network. And if you're someone, pardon me, who's dealing with issues like the one we're talking about today, which has to do with preachers' kids, please come visit us at chnetwork.org, and especially if you're looking for support from others who are going through or who have been through what you're dealing with, then definitely check out our online community, which is community.chnetwork.org. Like I say, today we get to talk to a couple of preachers' kids. They've also both been preachers' wives, but we're not going to get into that as much today, I don't think. I want to focus on what it's like to have your daddy be the pastor, and how that shaped maybe their ideas about God, even shaped them towards the Catholic Church ultimately. Both Mary Jo Burchard and Denise Bossert have been on the journey home. I encourage you to go check out their stories. Denise does publications and pastoral care for the Coming Home Network, and Mary Jo's husband, Kenny, does development for the Coming Home Network, and he'll kill me if I don't tell you that you can support this and other projects of the Coming Home Network by going to chnetwork.org/donate. Mary Jo's got her own deal going on, but I got to mention that for Kenny. Denise, Mary Jo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be with you.
All right. So you both have preacher's kids stories, but neither one of yours is terribly conventional. So I grew up with, being pretty good friends with the preacher's kid in all the churches that I ever went to. Anybody who's had kids of my age who was a preacher, and then went to Bible college, and there was a realm of stuff going on. There were some preachers' kids who were like the most straight-laced kids on campus. The others were like, you want to know where to buy weed, go to the preacher's kids or the missionaries' kids. Like it was a range. Let me just tell you, a range. So I'll start with you, Mary Jo, because I know your dad was a fixer. What kind of preacher's kid situation did you grow up in?
That's a great question. I would say it started out with my dad being the dean of men at a Bible college that trained international people that were coming there from all over the world, a place called Christ for the Nations in Dallas. And that kind of was the backdrop for when he went back into local church, because that was during my elementary school years, my early elementary school years. And it really shaped my understanding of God's direct engagement all over the world, and just a hunger to see people understand the gospel and just the sacrifice that so many people were making just to have faith. And so my perception of what it meant to be a Christian, what it cost to be a Christian, and what it meant to be serious about my faith was shaped by living on that campus and, being around people who had sacrificed everything and were planning on going back into those environments when they had formal training. So when my dad really was missing local church context, he had done it before that, but I was younger and wasn't paying as close attention. So being a PK, starting in the 6th grade in a local church just in suburbia, United States, was really culture shock for me, because the expectations and the motivations behind why people wanted to call themselves Christians seemed like a completely different context. And so I felt very disoriented because I couldn't find anybody that I really related to culturally. And I also didn't feel like we were talking about the same Christianity anymore. So, and he took, as you said, he was a fixer. So he tended to take churches that needed our family to come because they were in crisis. Something bad had happened right before we had gotten there. And so the propensity for people to not trust the church leadership, and for the likelihood for us to be hyper scrutinized was higher because of what they had just experienced. And so, add that layer in, and it was a little awkward. I would say the other thing that kind of defined the PK experience in my family is that my parents always said, you have your own spiritual gifts and we expect you to live like you mean it. And so from the time I was a little kid, I was assisting my mom in kids church. And by the time I was in late elementary, I was teaching kids church and she was assisting me. And I helped on the worship team. And wherever there was a hole, we would just jump in and fill it, because when we got there, we could already see people were already hurting. And so that was normal for me. So I would say those are the big pieces that stick out to me, that and the fact that we moved so much. If I were to stay through a school year, it was really exciting. But I didn't ever very often expect to stay more than one school year all the way through. So built into that, almost like a military kid, is the expectation that you're not going to be here longer. So it was almost like I had a bucket list mentality. I don't know how long we have. Tell me all your hopes and dreams. Let's do all the things that we can do in this space while we can, because pretty soon
check
I
out all
won't
the
be here
local
anymore.
restaurants.
Yeah,
all that stuff. And real quick before I go to Denise, what denominational world was this?
Yeah, so my parents grew up in Baptist and Nazarene environments, but then they had what many would call a Pentecostal experience, and so my dad would just say, I'll go anywhere where I can preach the word without compromise, which, again, raises a lot of Catholic questions later. But
that's going to be extremely important based on a question that I have for both of you later on.
Yes. So when we were at Christ for the Nation, before he was at Christ for the Nations, he was on faculty at a Criswell Center for Biblical Studies, which is a very Baptist school. And then he was Dean of Men at a non-denominational charismatic school. And then he took a non-denominational church in Idaho, and then a Baptist church that had half charismatics and half diehard Baptists, and both were saying, if you love us, you'll make them leave. I know before, when I was younger, he was at a spirit-filled Lutheran church. And then Assemblies of God is, I think, where he landed his formal papers. His
official ordination.
Yes, his official ordination was through Assemblies of God. So
that's the whole bingo card. I
Yep.
don't think we're missing anything there, except for I think that actually Denise might fill out a couple that you didn't mention. So Denise, if you could, mention sort of like how your world was shaped and what kind of experience you had of being a preacher's kid.
So my father was still in Bible college when I was born. My parents met in Bible college and got married at the end of their freshman year of college. And, of course, Mom quit then. And I think my dad took a year off right after they got married, and she got pregnant, and they came back right about the time my sister was born. And then 10.5 months later, I was born. So they had 2 little girls by the time Dad graduated college. And he was a Wesleyan pastor, Matt, and they didn't require seminary. All they required was Bible college. So then when I was about 3.5, my father took his first parish, or his first church in the Wesleyan denomination. It was a little tiny rural church in Iowa. And that was where I first, was introduced to like the holiness movement. I remember prayer meetings at church, people on their knees praying. And they would talk about, backsliding. And I was only like probably 5 at the time, but it was a big deal to just really be vigilant about your walk with Christ. And then Dad took another pastorate, and this time it was in a college town. And the demographic was a little bit different, and it was a little bit harder for Mom to kind of keep tabs on us, because kind of kids ran, the blocks and just played, and it wasn't quite that rural holiness movement kind of thing. And so it was a little bit harder on the family, I think, especially on Mom. And then my grandfather, her father, passed away in a farming accident. And so my parents stepped away from pastoral ministry to take care of Grandma's farm until it could be put up for auction, because she couldn't, of course, do the farming herself. And so during that time, there were two Presbyterian pastorates that were yoked, and they didn't have a pastor at the time. So my father started just on Sunday, in between, his farming week, he would fill in the pulpit, and they ended up liking his sermons, I guess, because they asked him to be their pastor. So that was a switch to go from Wesleyan to Presbyterian. And I don't really remember there being a lot about Reformed tradition or, the idea of what's the cornerstone, where, it's like already predetermined whether you're going to heaven or hell. I don't remember any of that, but I do remember it being a little bit more close to the early church, where we talked about sacraments. We had a confirmation class. We learned the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, and we learned the Apostles' Creed. So in some ways, it was closer to the early church. I had cousins who were Assembly of God, and they eventually went into ministry and married pastors and became missionaries there. So I think the thing that I was really seeing and wrestling with during really the K through 12 age bracket was that there are so many good things out there in different denominations, but where would you go if you wanted to find all of them in one place? Because, as Mary Jo was saying, with, my cousins were charismatic, but Presbyterians definitely were not. And although I'm sure there are some that are, but as a denomination, it wasn't. And Wesleyans, I remember my parents saying that when some people received the gifts of the Holy Spirit, they were kicked out of the Wesleyan church. And if you, as a pastor, became charismatic, you were kicked out of the church. You could not be a Wesleyan pastor. So there was this definite, where do you go for the sacramental life? What if you want to be charismatic? We didn't hear anything more about the holiness movement as Presbyterians. And so, yeah, you're left with this, what do I do with all of this? What does it mean to be a follower of Christ? Is it like Marcus Grodi says, is it just an inch thick and a mile wide? Or is it deep waters? And so those are some things that I struggled with. As far as, I only remember one occasion where somebody really was kind of bullying me for being a preacher's kid. It wasn't really seen as something that was bad. In fact, in the churches, I was used to the red carpet being rolled out for being a pastor's kid. You were like the front of the line, or, sitting in the very front of the church. You kind of almost had a position of honor that you didn't really deserve. But, and so that was something that certainly changed when I became Catholic.
Yeah, so I want to hold a thought that both of you brought up, which is what do you make of the fact that your dads are pastoring all these different denominational contexts, and what are you supposed to do with that? But, for people who maybe don't, because I know there are some lifelong Catholics who are probably watching this too and thinking this is all super weird, because, there's a kind of a movement afoot. It has been for, decades of priests should be married, priests should be allowed to have families. And, I think that, there's certainly in the context that I came from, that was you couldn't really be a good pastor unless you had a family. How are you supposed to know how to run a church if you couldn't run a family? I mean, that's kind of the mentality that we came from. But there's a lot of risk that you're taking by hiring a pastor who's on the payroll and a family who is not, so I wonder, for you all, what kind of pressure was there for you to not put your dad's job at risk by your behavior? I mean, Mary Jo, did you ever feel you were, or did you even sense the weight of that?
I didn't sense it in that way. I sensed a definite weight of heaviness I would put it this way. I felt like our family had a different expectation from God on us, a weight that we carried. In Europe, there's this terminology for the Middle Ages, where they would talk about or not the Middle Ages really, but like the Georgian period, that sort of thing, where you have the upstairs people and the downstairs people. I felt very much like a servant class person, not a celebrity by any stretch, but very much a servant. It was the expectation, not by my parents were with me in this, but because I was born into this family, I felt that the weight of the Lord was my fellowshipping in his suffering and the cross that I carried, and I gladly carried it, was you get there, you unpack, you roll up your sleeves, and you serve hard. Any hole you fill, you just fill it. And that is your privilege as somebody who is fellowshipping in the suffering of Christ and who loves, the children of God, and so I didn't draw the line.
You would have felt like your vocation was an extension of your father's vocation.
Absolutely. I would say it was our family's vocation. I felt that, the way that my parents, from the very youngest that I can even imagine, there was very much my dad, I remember my first Bible, that besides the gift and award Bible that you had to have on your school supply list, was a Thompson chain, a King James Thompson chain. And I knew how to work that thing. And then when I got, I think a couple of years later, I got I cut my teeth on my first Strongs and Vines. My dad would hold me as a little kid accountable and say, don't take my word for it. You judge everything that I say by the word. And if I'm getting it wrong, you challenge me on it and we'll work it out together. I took it very seriously, but looking back, that's a heavy weight to be your own magisterium at 8, I felt that weight very heavily. And then when I would look around and I would see people who seemed like church was an optional extracurricular activity, I didn't know what to do with that. So we're serving hard, but it seemed like everyone that we were serving had more of a customer mentality than a disciple mentality. And so I remember my allowance, setting much of my allowance and my babysitting money aside to sponsor an organization called Open Doors with Brother Andrew. It was the Suffering Church. And the only way I could make sense out of what I was seeing was to say, this is an American problem. The world of the body of Christ isn't like this. People are suffering for the gospel, and I'm just going to pour. So I was constantly, people called me a crusader, and I dressed like a punk. I didn't know how to put it all together, but I had friends on the full spectrum, but I was constantly saying, why don't you act like you believe this? Do you believe it for real? Why are you doing this? And so I had anger and frustration and a lot of that, but I didn't direct it toward. I remember when I was about 14 or 15, my dad told me, Joe, you've got so much pent up frustration and anger in you, and you don't seem like you know what to do with it. It's getting between you and your relationship with the Lord. You need to figure out what to do about it. And I had to work hard on it. My dad's doctorate is in pastoral counseling, so that was helpful. But it was a struggle. It was a lifelong struggle to know what to do with people not knowing how to make sense of their faith, how to take it seriously, and also feeling like our lot in life was to be the ones that got beaten down for it, move on, and try and clean up another mess that wasn't going to get cleaned by the time we were gone.
Yeah.
So
that's rough.
It's a different weight.
Well, and it's also, and you mentioned this earlier, that part of that is born of having seen what the global church looks like and seen people for whom the stakes were a lot higher. But when it comes to like living their faith on an everyday basis. But Denise, did you have a sense that your life was an extension of your father's? Because I've known families that kind of have it, there's a range of ways that people experience this. Like, did you feel like you were a supporting cast member, or did you feel like this was part of your vocation?
it's interesting because my experience was different, I think, than Mary Jo's. I remember feeling, more like, instead of like the upstairs people, more like the downstairs people, in that, it felt like we were to do the special music. We were supposed to, like, I don't know, help the show go on. Not that we felt it was a show, but like that it was what we did. And if I can maybe analyze it a little bit, I think it might be because, Mary Jo, your family sounds very much like missionary driven. And my family, while some went into missions, it didn't feel like that it was that element of it. It was more like theology. And I would have conversations with my father on where philosophy and theology intersect. So it was more like kind of a heady kind of a thing. And that could be because he changed denominations from Wesleyan to Presbyterian and he went to seminary. So that was during my middle school experience that he was doing that transition. And it was very much part of the conversation at the dinner table talking about theological things. So it wasn't, in fact, when we would have youth group and the youth group was supposed to go and cut the grass, mow the lawn of some elderly lady in the church, and the others in the parish wouldn't show up, my dad would drag us. But it was really about the only time where it was like service oriented. And I remember not liking that responsibility of like, okay, I'll do special music, but I don't want to go cut somebody's grass, So, yeah, that might be where the tug was, but there wasn't this push to service, maybe to help teach with Vacation Bible School or something like that. But it was Dad's position. He was the pastor. We were the pastor's family, and we were in a glass fishbowl. But I remember Mom saying, our expectations of you we would have even if your father, was a trash collector. This is what we expect of you. But my father never did. In fact, I had kind of an opposite experience from Mary Jo with my father. It was also a loving relationship, but he did not put me on the spot at all with regard to my walk with Christ. I think for Dad, his way of parenting as a pastor was just massive unconditional love. I remember getting in trouble. I remember being disciplined by him, but he was much more, let's talk about faith and let's talk about theology and philosophy together. And, just weird conversations like my sister went into science and he was talking with her about science and she said something, well, I believe Adam and Eve. I don't believe this stuff, even though she was feeling attraction to the subject matter of science. And I remember Dad saying, do you know what Adam and Eve looked like? Just causing us to just think about things, without telling us really what to think. And so later on, with regard to, coming into the church, it felt like an extension of that unconditional love, just following that thread. So yeah, it was different and yet it was kind of the same.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say I definitely relate to the fishbowl. And I have to say, music was, we did the special music and the share on this or, speak on that, train on this, coordinate that. But and it's interesting because music is such an important part of my life, but it almost felt like even after I left home, the way that whole thing developed, because it had the lens of servanthood, it felt like I wouldn't even think that I was allowed to, by whom I don't know, join a band or, go busking or, any of those things that people that enjoy music would, think about doing, because I only thought of it as, it was like there was a plexiglass thing around me that said, you're relegated to using this only to serve, and serve meant something very narrow. And my dad and I, probably have had some of the deepest theological and philosophical conversations of anybody, but it was always in motion. I feel like we had people in our home a lot. I remember when I was in the 6th grade, we lived on a corner, and I think once a week we had Bible studies, and then twice a week we had prayer meetings or something like that. It was like 3 days a week. We had tons of people in our house. And so the whole area would have cars. And I remember somebody in the neighborhood saying, "Oh, you live on the house that has all the parties." And I remember thinking, it just shocked me, because, what you live through becomes your normal, and you don't really think about how unusual it is to constantly have people, constantly be hosting, constantly be giving, constantly be serving, and always being on in that space. It didn't feel like I was being whiplashed or anything, but it just felt like, that was life. That was what I was born into and what I got to do, even though it was hard, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And, I think all of us kind of have our own little world in which we grow up, and we don't realize that it's like strange until we get out. And, maybe it wasn't even that strange, but we don't realize that it's an experience that's different than what other people have been having till you get out of it. But one of the things that is, I think, unique to both of your experiences is because you didn't see, some people church shop and they bounce from denomination to denomination, and they see the different flavors of Christianity, but they see it from a consumer side. They see it from I'll decide whether I want to go to this church or not. Like, you guys didn't get to decide which church you went to, right? You were dialed in 1,000% on whatever church your dad had a job at. So that was the option. Your dad was always your pastor. You didn't you can be like, "I don't like this pastor, I'm going to move on," right? You didn't have that option. So, but as a result, you had, in both of your cases, dads who were pastors who weren't just like, "Well, this is the denominational line, so we're just going to stick with it." These were men who wanted to know God. They wanted to know his heart. They wanted to know, how to better communicate Christ to the people they were serving. So in that, you got a realm of denominations in both of your backgrounds. So for you, how did that world start steering you, or did you even realize it was steering you towards asking the kind of questions that would lead you towards Catholicism? Denise, I'll start with you on this, because I know you've shared with this at length in a couple of different contexts.
Right. Well, one of the first things I think that it formed me as is you were formed to be a pastor's wife. I mean, without the words being said, that felt comfortable. Being in the pastor's family was like your identity. Being someone who got up and spoke and led, that felt familiar. Which then after I became a convert and a writer and then, speaking and sharing my conversion story, that felt normal, where cradle Catholics would be like, how can you get up and do that? How can you get up and be evangelize?
You're like, I've been doing this since I was 5. What are you talking about? Right? I
didn't know how not to. It's just who I am. But, so I think that there were gifts there that made it what then happened afterwards with being a convert made it, fit well. It just made it, I know how to do this. And if there are others who don't know how to do this, I do know how to do this. I don't know. I don't know. I think the other thing though is it doesn't set you up for too many questions, because you really are what your Father is. And I remember sometimes saying to him, and I don't remember which parish he was in, but saying, it just seems like it's sort of dry. And our cousins who were Assembly of God, they just had these vibrant youth group meetings and stuff like that we would, go to when we visited them. And I remember like, oh, why is our youth group just so blah, like as Presbyterians or whatever? And I remember Dad say, grow where you're planted. So in a way, it was like until I became a grown up, and I even attaching to someone who then became a pastor means I didn't really have, wasn't even steering my own ship even then. But you didn't really have a choice like others do, where like they can church hop and they can find a church that fits well and they can ask themselves these questions. In a way, it's set, what your denomination is. So, I don't know. There really weren't questions in there until the big question came, and we're not quite ready for that. So I kind of just went with the flow.
Right, and you've shared, if nobody's had a chance to see, how the question of suffering especially played into your journey, I encourage you to go back and see the Deep in Christ episodes. There's a 3-part series that you did with John Mark Grodi on just how big that question was in your search. But Mary Jo, I'm wondering, like in the case of your bouncing from denomination to denomination, I mean, one of the things that people come to us all the time with is like this question of sola scriptura, like how are all these people who are reading the same book that I'm reading, who are praying to the Holy Spirit the same way I'm praying to the Holy Spirit, how are they coming up with like something slightly different here and slightly different here? Like, were you conscious of that at all, or was that in the background, or?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And it wasn't even just denomination to denomination within one community. It was state to state and region to region, culture to culture. So there was so much upheaval that really the only two, I would say, threads that were a constant in my life were my nuclear family and my I know it's overused, but my personal connection to a living Savior, and I actually had a dream that, there was just chaos and like tornado, hurricane kind of level winds. And I couldn't see anything, almost like Over the Rainbow. What is that show? Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz.
Yes,
there
when she hits her head and you see all the things, the cow floats by and it was kind of like that. But all I could see were the eyes of Jesus saying, not even with words, but just stay right here, And so for me, my normal was stay connected to Jesus and watch your heart. Don't let it get hardened or bitter. Just keep doing the best that you can to stay forgiving and do your best to own what you can. And so I was flooded with questions all the time. And I spent a lot of time with my dad trying to work out my theological issues, because on top of the church reality, depending on whether we were in inner city or, we were in a place that didn't have good schools. Both my parents were also educators. My mom was a credentialed teacher. My dad was a school administrator and a school counselor as well. So they would assess the school district. And if it didn't look like it was going to be good, we would either homeschool or we would be in the public school. So you add that layer in. And so Christian schools of vastly different denominations from what my dad would ever pastor, I was exposed to, on a day-to-day basis, in some ways more intimately than, where I was a pastor's kid, and so having that constant culture shock. And so how did it shape me? I would say one of the biggest things that it did throughout my childhood was kind of almost idealize, I'm going to be a warrior for Christ. If I'm the only one, I'm going to be the only one who doesn't bow, I'm going to be the one who goes to where nobody else goes. I'll be a missionary in the deepest, darkest, cannibal, whatever, the through gates of splendor kind of, I'm going to do whatever the hard thing is. I want to do that. And I'm going to find the other serious people who want to do that. So that was kind of like my mental escape is, how can I take this as seriously as I can? And so I lived in a state of rumble. When I was in my early 40s or late 30s, it was the first time that I read a book called Third Culture Kids. And it's about kids who live in another country. And so there's the culture of the country, there's the culture of the nuclear family. And the third culture is this culture that's this amalgamation of that straddling place. And I wept because it was the first time that I felt like I had a word to set on my experience. And my first culture was a nebulous, but still there were constants, church culture. And that was my first culture. And then my second culture was the region, the denomination, all of that stuff that was constantly in flux. And so my mandate, my dictate was whatever I do, whatever is in flux, which is most things, I have to be grounded in what I know God knows about me, how he sees me, and make sure that I am at least doing the best that I can to be a warrior or a contender for the truth, in a way that doesn't make me bitter. That was tricky.
Hey,
but
you don't have to tell me this. I was in the Christian punk and metal world. Like, this is all like, I mean, that's the rage we were dealing with.
Right.
So I mean, you don't gotta explain that to me. I mean, because we were like, why is nobody taking this seriously but us? That was kind of our mentality.
Yeah, which is why I dabbled in that area too, so we could probably talk bands.
Well, see, that's another on an upcoming episode of CH Network Presents. We'll get to that and figure out some more of sort of the punk rock nuance. But I've got kind of a closing question, and it's really so. I wish we had. I mean, like I say, I could ask you guys about this stuff for about 2 more hours, but I have sort of a 2-part question that I want to sort of get in before we go, and it has to do with this. It has to do with the question of going from the head of the church being your dad to the head of the church being the Pope. So it's wrapped up in that is I think probably kind of how you had to deal with going from the local to the church universal. But in that too, like, and don't feel pressure to share any more personally than you feel comfortable with, but is there a sense by like shifting from the authority of like the church that your dad was in to this universal church, like, is there an excitement of going to something that's like solid and real and global? Or is there a fear associated with that? And in that, is there a fear associated with, well, I'm like betraying, in some sense, this thing that I was given, this thing that I was built to be? Denise, I know you shared at length about this question, and you've had some of these kinds of conversations more publicly. Did you have any thoughts on that?
I think this is one of the most meaty questions that I think someone who was in a pastor's family can wrestle with, is the legacy question. In part, I think I was made for this. And I was formed for this because I think the foundational thing was wherever Jesus leads you, you must go. And even though the family, by then my father was already deceased, and it was his suffering that was my question that led me into the church. So he wasn't there to talk to. And in a way that was, I think, a necessary part of my journey because he was like my Pope. So I would have gone to him to talk and have those theological discussions. So he had to be removed in order for me to have this void where I would wrestle with theology and be willing to move into a different space and place. And my mother, of course, did not understand what I was doing. My siblings did not understand. But I think the thing that Dad had left me with, the legacy question that was the most important, was wherever Jesus leads you, you must go. And if you do not do that, even though you are convicted that this is what you need to do, then that is a disobedience. So I was, I think, prepared to do that. And as I started to uncover it, the hardest thing for me was Mary, especially the Immaculate Conception, because my father had wrestled with that in seminary. And he probably would have become Catholic except for that one thing. So I needed a really big movement of grace in order to receive that and accept that. But I think that the best way to answer the legacy question is the legacy that you are given as a pastor's kid or someone in a pastor's family is where Christ leads you, you must go. And that was the ultimate. And it still is, still gives me shivers because Jesus Christ is here in the Eucharist. I will not go anywhere else because he is everything to me and has been since I was a very little girl.
Yeah. Mary Jo, I asked like one of those like hardcore, deeply personal questions. So feel free to go as into it or not into it as you feel comfortable. But I think this really is, because there are preachers' kids watching this right now who are at this crossroads and they kind of want to sort of hear probably the answer. This is probably the question that's at the back of their minds underneath all of it.
Yeah. And adding a layer in my family, my nuclear family was not the only family in my family that was clergy. In fact, my mother's, two of my mother's brothers were also pastors, and the brother that wasn't had kids who were, and my dad's sister was married to a pastor, and it was like going to either side of the family. It was like going to a pastor's conference. And so I am the only Catholic on either side of the family. I mean, biologically linked to this either side. It was a big, big deal, that whole idea of, and me not wanting to tell my parents initially the rumble that we were going through, because I didn't want them at all to feel that I was leaving the faith that they poured into me. I was going deeper. And I was so grateful that when I contacted my mom, exactly what Denise said, my mom was, I just think, anointed by the Lord. She said, "Jo, this is all about mission." She said, the Bible says that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord like the waters cover the sea. How could that happen without the Catholics? They're everywhere. And she said, if God is calling you in, you have to go all the way in. And she said, in the words of Mary, do whatever he tells you. She had no idea the depth of prophetic power those words had, but I remember learning about the Viaticum, and the final Eucharist that one takes to cross over. And when our priest was talking about the Viaticum the first time, it was during the reading of people in the desert, wandering in the desert, and what is manna called, but what is it, right? What is it? And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And while all of that was happening, I had a flashback to my childhood, what felt like a wandering, there was no, this is the one true, other than Jesus, other than the essentials. There was no, it was a wandering and looking around and seeing it was like snow coming down. It was all Christ. It was all Christ coming down with me saying, what is it? What is it? What is it? Christ was pulling me into himself and saying, yes, you are called, not the way that you, because my great lament was, if we all love Jesus, why can't we all talk about unity in the essentials and liberty in the unessentials and in all things charity, but nobody agrees on what category to put everything in. We're lost, and so to have a true north and to have a standard, and I remember lamenting so many times when we were leaving another church saying, oh, if only we had the church in Ephesus, the church in, but instead we have all these fracture, giving birth to fracture, and to learn that didn't have to be, and that Jesus was pulling me into a true north and a conversation that wasn't going to eliminate division and confusion and sin, but it gave me a new thing to do, a new way to map out whatever was going on by a standard that wasn't shifting with the wind, was so incredibly I think that was the greatest relief of coming home. However incredibly disorienting it was to learn a whole new vocabulary, a whole new definition of words that I was teaching. You know, it was like the ultimate, here's your new place. You are now the tour guide, and you don't know the language yet, and you don't know the culture, but you are now the tour guide. And there was still such a deep relief because there was a true north. There was a compared to what? There was a who gets to say. For the first time in my life, I thought I had to go through the rumble of Mary too. I had to deeply rumble, but I thought there is an answer. And I was also deeply, you know, one of the things, being a scholar myself, I couldn't stop asking the questions until I had a PhD in ecclesial leadership, you know. And that's one of the things that brought me home. But I have scholar friends who say, well, what do you do when you disagree with the church? And my first response is, I assume I don't have all the answers anymore. And I want to convert their little voice into say, what do you do if you disagree? You know, because the comfort is I am now plunged into the global church in a new way and the ancient faith in an unbroken conversation. So obviously I'm missing stuff. I start with the assumption that I'm missing stuff. So I don't have to start with, well, I've read, so therefore I can stand over this universe of knowledge that I just got here for, you know. And so that's deeply relieving to me. Those are the big things that I so profoundly embrace that I could never, ever not be Catholic now.
Matt,
yeah,
if I could just
go ahead
with one thought. I think with regard to the legacy question, one of the things that began to really resonate with me when I first became Catholic was the reality that if you go back far enough in any of our families, whether or not we have lots of missionaries or pastors in our families, if we go back far enough, we are either pagan or we're Catholic. So the legacy question is, I have joined the legacy of my family. I don't know how far back, but it is not abandoning any legacy at all, but it's reclaiming a legacy of a church history that had been lost in the Reformation. And thanks be to God, I didn't lose anything. I gained everything in all of the treasure chests of all of the denominations that really go back to the full treasure chest of the Catholic Church.
I love that. And I would add one thing, and that is because we moved so much, we had a love for, but not a deep connection and hangout connection with any of my extended family growing up. And the local church was constantly moving. And so it felt like we were always on the outside trying to make our way in. And being plunged into the legacy of the Catholic Church, in such a deep sense, I feel like I am home anywhere in the world. When I go to the Basilica in DC, when I go to, you know, the Spanish missions in California, I walk in and I'm like, welcome to my home. Let me show you around. I don't even have to have been there before, but I know now how to show people this legacy that is now mine, you know, and that is so meaningful to someone who always felt like a nomad, always felt like I didn't get to have roots, you know, and that was a sacrifice that I would just give up to the Lord. It's like that hunger is satisfied by plunging myself into the family of God. Being in Christ, the communion of the saints, has never been more precious to me.
No, I'm with you 1,000%. And even non-preachers kids can get that, right? You know, anybody who's bounced around denominations and, you know, has ever been in that situation where you talk to somebody, you know, on an airplane and they're like, I'm a Christian. And then in the back of your mind, you're like, yeah, but what kind?
Right.
You know,
Sure.
But
Sure.
Whereas, you know, I was on an airplane coming home, you know, a couple of days ago, and the flight attendant's walking down and she's got a cross, and I can tell it's flipped around, so I can't see what it is, but it's some sort of a medal. And I'm just like, what's up? You know, it's like, that's my tribe. You know, it's like, these are my people. Like, I don't even have to know. It's like, and there's a billion of us. So we're to varying degrees, you know, working on this, and, you know, holiness is a along a continuum. But you're part of something. I don't have to say when I'm going, like you're saying, Mary Jo, like when you go from town to town, you don't have to say, well, let's try out a few churches to see which one works. You're like, I know which one's mine. I know which one of these is my church.
It's, I mean, you don't know, just even like, okay, we're going to go to the Vineyard or whatever. We're going to go to Foursquare. You never know really what you're going to get. With the Catholic Church, the Mass is the Mass. And, there's so much.
It may be a poorly executed one, but it's the Mass, right? It is what it is.
You can get, you're going to get certain things. You're going to get Scripture. You're going to get the Eucharist, the living presence of Jesus. You're going to experience it with your family, even if you haven't met. That's huge.
Well, this has been some extraordinary baggage to air for the whole world to see. Between the two of you as preacher's kids, and again, we didn't even get into the preacher spouse thing, which is a whole other conversation that requires its whole other set of situations and questions. But hopefully, if there's somebody listening right now who grew up in a missionary family, or a family that was in ministry, or even a family where the parents were professors at a evangelical college or something like that. I mean, this applies in a whole bunch of different circumstances and situations. And if that's you, then please reach out to us at the Coming Home Network. We know people who have been through what you're working on right now, and some of them are us. So chnetwork.org. And then if you want to plug in and be involved with the online community where people are actively in a social network chewing on these questions, that's community.chnetwork.org. And again, thank you so much, Denise Bossert, Mary Jo Burchard. I encourage people to go check out your Journey Home episodes, because we didn't even really get into the full reasons as to why you became Catholic. We just kind of got into the stuff that you dealt with as you were becoming Catholic. So definitely go check out those Journey Home episodes and find out more. Thanks so much, Denise and Mary Jo. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of CH Network Presents. Look forward to checking in with you again here next time around.